nicely where we've got to. So I'm just going to quickly do a mute all so we can't hear anyone's TVs and things in the background. Hopefully everyone can still hear me. You can give me a thumbs up if you can still hear me. Good, excellent. Okay. So at the end of last time, just doing a quick recap. If you kind of run along the bottom, we've gone from Pentecost, we've gone through Herod Agrippa dying, which that period around him, and the persecution in Jerusalem. That became quite a key moment because it actually pushed the mission out of Jerusalem and out of Judea and Samaria and the kind of the way things have been circling around there. And it seems that with the exception of probably Andrew, who had already started to go and visit some of those places from the Pentecost church, it seems to really kind of kick-started something with the apostles. The next little icon, we had the Council of Jerusalem in 49 AD, 49 to 50, which is a really key turning point moment, because although there has an acceptance early on from that the gospel was to go to the Gentiles, Jesus had told his disciples that when he was with them. He speaks to Peter in the vision at the house of Cornelius, and they recognize what they're supposed to do, but they're still trying to struggle with what does it mean, because the traditional way is to make a proselyte into Judaism. They still see themselves as within Judaism at this stage. The Council of Jerusalem is quite key because it gives them a means of let's do that. It gives the disciples a means to start to incorporate people into community without forcing those kind of heavy commitments of proselytism, and it really does then become a message which is for all cultures. Around 54 AD is the death of Caligula, wasn't it? I think at this point, so it's the beginning of Nero's reign, which becomes a key moment. And this is where we pick up the story, really. So it's Claudius, not Caligula, sorry. So in 54 AD that Claudius dies. As I say, he's probably poisoned by his last wife, but actually his adopted son, Nero, becomes the emperor. Because Claudius had actually been favouring a natural-born son, Britannicus, and it's interesting to notice his name, because it's Britannicus because actually it is Claudius who finally fully conquers the southern parts of Britain. And brings them into the empire. And at this point, Paul is in Ephesus. And then we kind of we started the way we finished last time. We started to consider Paul's journey as he starts to head towards Rome. So Paul's base, he's in and out of Ephesus. He's left Corinth. He's been at Corinth for a couple of years. He goes and establishes a mission base in Ephesus. His letters assume or imply that he actually seems to have a bit of a team of itinerating ministers connected with him there. They're planting churches around the Aegean Sea and the surrounding areas. So, for instance, it's often thought, if you read the commentaries, that Epaphras was either the church planter or the key leader in Colossae. But Paul probably hasn't been to Colossae, but he's writing to a church which he has oversight of, but probably someone like Epaphras has planted. But as I say, he seems to have a wider team too. I've put in quotes there, Paul's apostles of the Assemblies. It's an interesting little phrase. I don't know if anyone spotted it particularly before as you're kind of reading through in Corinthians. So he writes, as for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker for you. It seems that Titus is part of this team that I'm suggesting. As for our brothers, they are the apostles of the Assemblies, the glory of Christ. So he's talking about a group of people, as he writes, who he's referring to with this title, the apostles of the Assemblies, i.e. apostles of the churches, which I think, and of course, as we read through the book of Acts and we read Paul's letters, we find there are loads of individuals that he says, I sent so-and-so to you, so-and-so I'm sending to you, I'm sending so-and-so. And the word apostle just simply means to send, and I think Paul sees out of his sense of calling and apostleship from the Lord, that there are others who are kind of a part of that mix. If you want to tie it, and I'm not going to do this tonight because it's not, this isn't a pure Bible study, it's more the history. But you look in Ephesians where he talks about apostleship, he refers to Jesus giving apostles from his ascension. So he ascended, and then from there he gives gifts, and then he refers to apostles in those gifts. So obviously the apostles that we think of as the 12 They were all apostles, if you like, of the incarnation. They had a very specific task, which was to observe and to record and capture Jesus' message for us. And the significance of having 12 of them in particular, we see because they appointed a 12th one when Judas falls and so on. So they're apostles of the incarnation, if you like, the incarnation side. Then there are apostles that Scripture refers to who are kind of apostles of the resurrection, who encountered Jesus in the resurrection, and he commissions them from there. The end of Matthew, where he says, now I'm sending them into all of the world, go and make disciples of all nations. But Paul wasn't there. So Paul wasn't in the incarnation. He wasn't an apostle he wasn't an apostle from Jesus' body, laying hands on and so on. He wasn't an apostle of the resurrection, i.e. by virtue of Jesus sending to go and do something. You'll notice actually in the resurrection accounts, Jesus regularly sends people. So he sends Mary to go and declare the message of his resurrection. He sends the disciples he meets on the road to Emmaus to go and tell the disciples. There's a kind of an apostleship that's going on in the resurrection. But Paul, of course, missed both of those. But Paul is perhaps what he's describing here in Ephesians. I say here because we're not in Ephesians, but in Ephesians, where he talks about those that have been given from Jesus' ascension. So Paul is perhaps preeminent amongst those people that haven't really known Jesus in other ways, and people like Timothy and Titus would be similar. We're already in the book of Acts dealing with people who have a genuine apostolic calling, or commission, I should say, probably is the better word, an apostolic commission, a sense of being sent by Jesus, that's what the word means. And he refers to this as this little group as apostles of the Assemblies, and we kind of get an idea of who they are. Paul's writing Corinthians at around 55 AD, just at the point where he's leaving Ephesus to travel back through Macedonia. And at that point, Acts, for instance, tells us that Paul is accompanied by, and then gives a list of people. This is just the team on this particular day, I think. We don't have to assume they're the only ones. Sopater of Berea, Aristarchus, Secundus of the Thessalonians, Gaius of Derbe, Timothy and Tychus, and Trophimus of Asia. So we suddenly have this list of people who are accompanying Paul as he goes to visit the assemblies, who seem to be, if you like, I know we can't prove it, but I'm making this connection, this group that he refers to as, and that it seems that Paul has become the hub of a group of folks who, as I said before, increasingly we're understanding that people didn't tend to travel on their own. They tend to travel with people. Paul's done some early journeys with just one or two people, probably learning the efficiency of going with more because you can leave people behind when you move on and so on. And so that's perhaps the group he's referring to. So I just thought it's kind of interesting just to list. I thought this is not a complete list. It was just me kind of thinking, okay, let's think about some of the folks that Paul travelled with, or we meet with him travelling with. Obviously, he's travelled with Barnabas and John Mark on his first mission trip. He travels with Silas, who's sometimes called Silvanus, on his second mission trip. He meets Priscilla and Aquila, who've been in Rome. They've now gone down to Corinth. He meets them in Corinth. They go with Paul to Ephesus. There's Luke, who pops in to the journey that Paul's making as Paul moves around the different churches. Occasionally the book of Acts suddenly refers to we, as if Luke is there. So Luke's another. Archippus maybe doesn't travel. He seems to be the leader in the Colossian church. He's the son of Philemon and Aphia, who's also mentioned in Paul's letter there. Demas, who travels with Luke a lot. We often find the two of them together. There's a bit where Paul gets a bit disgruntled with Demas, but we don't know whether that's forever and ever or whether it was just at that point in the letter where says Demas has been tempted to go and have an easy life. Epaphroditus, we actually hear about him being specifically sent by Paul to the church in Philippi. You can keep going on. Philemon is the leader of a church and the owner of Onesimus. He's the father, of course, of who was it we just mentioned before, of Archippus. Then there's Tertius, who wrote Paul's letter to the Romans, who's with Paul there. Titus, he's seems to be a regular stand-in for Paul. He gets referenced several times. I've not put all of their references. You can look at them, but just kind of notice this sense of co-workers who I'm proposing perhaps Paul is understanding under this title of apostles of the Assemblies, i.e. people who are being sent to serve these churches. Because it's a really good description, that phrase. If you forget the kind of, if you like, if our religious connotations with the word apostle, and you just give it its normal sense, it's someone who's commissioned to be sent. And here we see Paul using all of these people in this kind of a way. There's Erastus, who we touched on, the Corinthian treasurer, who we found that marble plaque to, thanking him. Phoebe, the minister of the church in Cenchrea, who probably carries the letter to the Romans, actually takes it. Andronicus and Junia, probably a married couple who are outstanding among the apostles. He uses that phrase, I highlighted that last one, because actually that's what he says. A couple that we don't really know much about, Andronicus and Junia, so male and female, and he refers to them both as being outstanding among the apostles. Probably he's referring to the same group, this group of folks that he's got to minister to those churches around the Aegean. So I just thought it's kind of interesting because it gives you a different flavour. Sometimes we just haven't, as we don't stand and look back and think, okay, that makes sense. We can imagine somebody operating in that way. So during this period then, as I said, which we finished with last time, we noticed that Paul's gospel probably arrives. We can say that because Paul is writing 1 and 2 Corinthians around this time, and possibly Philippians as well. So we know he's visited Corinth and Philippi, lots of other churches while he's in Ephesus. But actually, in recounting his ministry in one of his letters to Corinthians, Paul actually refers to Luke's gospel. So it seems that in that kind of toing and froing as they're moving around, Luke's gospel has finally kind of got to a stage where it's usable. He hands it over to Paul. And Paul then refers to, we are sending along with him. You see, again, he's sending people again. We're sending along the brother who is praised by all of the churches because of the gospel, which I see as a reference to what Luke has just done. We touched on that last week, but we did it at speed. So during this same period, I placed the story of St. Aegean. And there is a degree to which, as we do a lot of these things, some of the dates are really concrete and some of them are trying to fit stuff in. This is one of those things where we're trying to fit stuff in. If we recognise the tombs that have been found over in China as being around mid-70s to mid-80s AD, it would be around this point that someone is heading there. And we do have this story about a silk merchant who's actually a producer of silk, so he's not just a seller, which means he is Chinese, because that is kind of a monopoly at this point. Who is commissioned by St. Aegean, or Thaddeus, but Thaddeus of the 72, and heads back towards China. He seems that he does come back. It seems he doesn't stay there full time, but he's the best person we can kind of link some sort of embryonic mission right out that way. We know that Thomas is going to come up into China, but probably from the south. Interestingly, and I don't know where he gets it from, the author of the work on Andrew that I've quoted from a few times via quite an extensive but interview with him in an English translation, because his work is all written in Greek. He actually gives a name to St. Aegean, a Chinese name, which is Wang Hai. Unfortunately, I couldn't track down where he got that from, but he talks about the sources in China that refer to him as Wang Hai. So presumably those are there, but I just can't tell you any more about them. And so, yeah, we saw those last time. Around this time as well, Andrew's heading north. We're going to see he's going to spend a lot of time up in eastern southern areas of Germany, Czechoslovakia areas, Romania, and so on. But he makes it quite far up from Kiev in the Ukraine. Yeah, he gets up to, that's right. He goes by river, and this is one of the things that's kind of been found more recently. The reason why this story is now being taken more seriously, as I was explaining to John and Rose before, is the stories themselves have got quite embellished. but they're distributed, and one seems to fit to another. So it's not that they're all in one place, but there are several of them as you kind of work your way up these areas. And as has been discovered, as we discover more about the trade routes, they seem to follow real trade routes. So they suddenly move from being kind of mythical, legendary, to being actually maybe embellished histories. And the logic was maybe 50 to 100 years ago was because it talks about things like talking leopards or other fantastical things like that, we ignore the whole testimony and assume nothing happened at all. Whereas now the approach is being, well, actually these seem to fit. So there's something here, and somehow the church got there, so this makes more sense. So you'll regularly hear people have other stories. I'm just trying to explain. We can't be 100% certain, but this is the way it fits together. So we come to 57 AD, and I'm going to make a bold statement for this point. This is really where we pick up this week, just reviewed last week, that Paul's work around the Aegean is now complete. Now, how do I say that? Why do I say that? Which is why I've got a little tick on the timeline. That, if you can see it on your screens, is a map of the Aegean with a green tick on it. Because Paul actually tells us. Paul tells us, I was often hindered in coming to you. This is when he writes to the Romans. But now there is nothing more to keep me in these parts. So he seems to be saying, I feel like my work is done. And I have now for many years desired to come to you, and when I go to Spain. So Paul is clearly kind of having a sense in which my work around this area has been finished. My work around the Aegean, into Greece, into southern Europe, that's coming to an end. I'm going to go on to Spain, but I'm going to go via Rome. I'm going to go on and do some work in Spain via Rome. But now I go to Jerusalem. So he's saying, I'm going to go back to Jerusalem to minister to the saints, and I will set out for Spain by way of you. So, but you notice he's only considering this because he feels in his mind he's now completed what he needs to do in that Aegean area that we associate Paul with. And that's probably because of the, if you like, the maturity of that little team that he has established, who seem to be in good control of the way that the church is growing in those areas as they visit with teachers and prophets and people to settle arguments and commission new leaders and so on. And so more than we've seen from some of the other stories, like as we've tried to follow Andrew's journey, who seems to be travelling much more as a solo person, or similarly with Thomas, he's understood the need, if you like, to release the second generation of apostleship. Of course, we know from the subsequent centuries that actually he obviously did a reasonably good job, because while we don't remember all of the names and details, we see the marks of it, and we're here. So 57, I say, he writes the Romans from Corinth. Peter doesn't seem to be in Rome at that time. In the sense of Paul doesn't try to greet him or comment to him. He refers to Peter in several other letters. He doesn't say anything at this point. So he may well be aware that Peter's not actually in Rome. He's been travelling through. He's probably heard reports of him where he is. He takes that last circuitous pastoral kind of tour, heading back towards Jerusalem before he's going to visit Rome and then Spain. He picks up Luke in Philippi. Paul and Luke and the others, they travel to Jerusalem. They're received by James and all the elders. No reference to Peter again. So perhaps Peter is still working his way kind of through Samaria or Syria or whatever. John doesn't seem to be there either. Although we're going to find out he's soon going to be based in Ephesus, along with other apostles and elders. And then this is where the chain of events, of course, happens that leaves Paul under arrest in Caesarea, where Philip the evangelist now lives. So the following, as we kind of read the story, the following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, Be cheerful, Paul. For as you've testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness in Rome as well. The context here is that Paul has stood in the temple and he's preached Jesus. The people have got really angry. It's caused a big riot. The Roman soldiers have had to run down. They stand on the bottom of the steps, which then run into the courtyard, but they don't go into the temple because that would cause the riot to explode even more. And Paul has stood on the steps, so he's now on Roman territory because he's standing on the steps of the fort of Antonia. The crowds are there in the temple precinct and he preaches to them, and we know the story. It's in that context that he has this vision. So for the next couple of years, he's going to be stuck. He's going to be held eventually in Caesarea, which is just out on the coast, straight out from Jerusalem onto the coast, where Philip the Evangelist has probably settled. That's the last time we met him. And that actually gives Luke a couple of years of access to Jesus' family and other eyewitnesses. So I suspect that the gospel he's put together, which perhaps has kind of followed the same pattern that we have in established in Matthew, which Mark has also followed, perhaps some of the bits that break that pattern, because if you look at the bits that break that pattern, they are often eyewitness driven. They are stories from Mary or stories from Jesus' family at the very least. Stories about John the Baptist, which would require more access to people who are well involved in that movement. So it's probably during those 2 years where perhaps Luke's gospel gets expanded a little bit. We know his gospel is not quite in the form that we get it, because the old traditions, the early church traditions, was it's written as part of Paul's defence in Rome. That's where it finally kind of comes together, or the book of Acts comes together in Rome, I should say. And seeing as there are elements in Luke's gospel which tie into the final version we have of Acts, writing to Theophilus, his Roman name, and so on, Luke's gospel probably gets its final edit when they're in Rome. So he's collecting extra stories here. Put a little picture in the corner. Caesarea Maritima, this coastal city, is quite a phenomenal engineering feat. If you can see in the water there, that was an entirely man-made harbour that they created. There was no natural harbour along the beach down that coast. So the Romans just physically built one. They invented a new kind of concrete that sets underwater, which becomes really important to them. And actually built out with concrete that sets underwater and becomes incredibly successful, this massive port. So in a very, very short period of time, Caesarea actually becomes one of Rome's largest cities, because it becomes a key trading point right in the middle of the Atlantic. That's where Paul is held. So in 59 AD, after a couple of years of being held under house arrest, he stands before Festus. He makes his appeal to Caesar. The appeal is honoured. Paul has to make a case before Agrippa as well. Festus is the key one though, and Paul then departs for Rome. He sails via Myra. He sails to a place called Myra via Sidon. Oops, I've gone too far there. There you go. There's Myra, that little red line. So he goes via Sidon. So Sidon's the first dot up. You can see I scribbled that on myself. Meanwhile, in Rome, Agrippina, the mother of Nero, gets assassinated. All sorts of fun things happen in Rome. From Myra, they work their way off to Cnidus, which is just a bit further around the coast, as you can see it. And then they sail for a place which is called Fair Havens on Crete. And in spite of Paul's warning, they leave Crete, set sail again. They hit a massive storm, which you can see I've wonderfully illustrated on the map with a squiggly line as they go all over the place. And they get shipwrecked on the island of Malta. So this is all well known. They kind of, I've shown you for some reason that map shows you going all the way up to Rome, but there's Malta. I was going to point to it on my screen, but you can't tell what I'm pointing at. So when they get to the edge of Rome, Paul actually stays at the Three Inns, where he takes courage, which I always thought as a teenage kid was kind of vaguely amusing, that Paul stays at the Three Inns and takes courage. So if you're not so familiar with kind of 70s drinking culture, it may not make so much sense to you. But he's welcomed by the believers as he moves in. He moves into Rome. He's received without prejudice by the Jewish community, which implies they've not heard the story from 2 years ago where he caused such a riot in Jerusalem. And he preaches, therefore he's able to preach the gospel without hindrance for 2 whole years while he's in a rented house or waiting to stand before Caesar, to get his audience with Caesar. So, back to 57 AD, just to do some things we didn't look at last time. I'm going to introduce you just to a kind of interesting character. At the end of Paul's in Rome, it's about 60 AD. In 57 AD, Tacitus, as a Roman historian, records that there's a member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So, i.e., they're part of the wider ruling family of Julius Caesar. So the Julio-Claudian have been emperors up to now, whose name is Pomponia. And she's the wife of a guy called Aulus Plautius, who's the first governor of Britain. So that has some interest for me. I'm always interested in those things. He's governor of Britain in 43 to 46 AD. Although I've not put it onto this timeline, there is a second century theologian that seems to say that that Simon the Zealot gets to Britain in 44 AD. Seems to. I'm going to put him in a bit later. We'll see later. It's highly speculative, but I mention it. but actually, this one's less speculative. This is quite interesting. So she's actually accused in 57 AD of practicing a foreign religion. And she gets tried before her own husband, and he acquits her, not surprisingly. Well, I was going to say, what does that tell us? I don't know. But right from the early physical hard records in Rome, for instance, you find inscriptions in the catacombs built around 200 AD that refer to her and list subsequent members of her family as being Christians. So in 57 AD, we have an account of someone who's practicing a foreign religion as a woman, known as Pomponia Graecina. So it's either 57 or AD or 62 to 63, because I assume that Paul he's writing actually Philippians from Rome, so I'd probably go for the later date. Some people put it earlier and say that when he's kind of in process. But Paul actually then writes to Philippians, and he says, "All the saints greet you, especially those who are of Caesar's household." And we miss the meaning of that phrase, Caesar's household, because these are very, very, very important Romans. And so by 62 AD, Paul is actually referring to one of those people who's sending greetings to the church. And we actually have the reference to a member of Caesar's household who's being tried for practicing a foreign religion, if that makes sense. So just putting the pieces together, she's looking, and then we discover that her family are all Christians, and they're recorded in the catacombs. See how you put the pieces together? So here's Pomponia Graecina as she's been played in various significant and important historical dramas. She's in the novel Quo Vadis, which of course has been turned into a couple of films, and gives her. But her husband, interestingly, also gives her a possible connection to another possible early Christian as well, in Rome. But I'll leave that till we actually get to 66 AD. But it's just kind of interesting that as Paul writes Philippians at just this point as he's arriving in Rome, where we know that someone has just gone through trial, and we know who the person is and so on. So just to kind of give a little bit of a touch on this, Aulus Plautius, who's her husband, has actually driven the British king Caratacus, who we might remember from the rather corny song, the ladies of the harem of the court of King Caratacus were just passing by. I don't think they ever did pass by. He was a British king. So he's actually been captured, and he's actually led to Rome in 50 AD as part of Claudius's triumph. So there's a British king, and he seems to be honoured. Which it seems also that the triumph that is held by Claudius also honours Plautius, and he gets pardoned by Claudius, and he becomes a member of Roman high society along with his family. So they all come in, and it's interesting because famously Caratacus makes a speech in front of the Senate. He's much more educated. We often think of it being very barbaric. They're not Romans; they're independent, but they are kind of at a similar, maybe not as engineeringly technical level, but they're not totally ignorant. He makes this kind of famous speech, but it's thought that his daughter takes the name Claudia to honour Caesar. So it's Claudius who's given them the freedom, effectively. He does so. So it's thought she takes the name, and that she's actually then becomes the Claudia Rufina, who's honoured in a poem called On Claudia Rufina by a poet called Martial. So I think we're going to leave that at this. Oh no, I've still got them in here. Okay, I thought I moved this to later. So I'm sorry about that. Although born among the blue-eyed Britons, now fully has Claudia Rufina the intelligence of the Roman people. So he refers to her as being a Briton. What beauty is hers! The matrons of Italy might take her for a Roman, those of Attica for an Athenian. The gods have kindly ordered that she proves fruitful to her revered husband, and that while yet young she may hope for sons and daughters-in-law. And may heaven grant her ever to rejoice in one single husband and to exult in being the mother of 3 children. That's the way Marshall puts it. Now, the point he's writing could be later than 50s. She may have been born in Rome, for instance, but she's British, it seems. He tells us another poem about someone called Claudia Peregrina Rufus, which is probably the same person, who's to marry his friend Aulus Pudens, which is another Claudia, but maybe in the same family. Seems to be. Because he's referring to her as the Red Foreigner. So, yeah. Aulus Pudens was a Roman centurion, and Paul actually writes, Eubulus salutes you, as do Pudens, Linus, and Claudia, all the brothers. I'm really annoyed because I've definitely moved this, and for some reason it's appearing. I obviously didn't remove it. I was going to. It would have fitted better when I got later. But you can see the point I'm bringing here. There are various characters creeping into Paul's letters from Rome, and actually we have some reference to them. And what's kind of interesting from my point of view is there are certain little connections with the islands of Britain, the ends of the earth, as we think about it. So church tradition actually tells us the Pudens that is referred to by Paul here is not the same Pudens, but actually he could be his son. So it could all still be part of the same family. So let's move on. Yeah, Eubulus suits you, as do Pudens, Line, and Claudia. So they're either referring to, that line refers then probably to a Greek official, Eubulus, which is good for good counsel, a Roman senator who's a patron of the Roman Church, i.e. probably the older Pudens, even though there's a younger one as well. His mother, who's a Briton from the ends of the earth, Claudia Rufina, and also the new leader of the church in Rome. The reason I put this in 66 is you don't know that Linus is the leader of the church in Rome yet, because we haven't got there. But Linus actually, at about the point when Paul is writing it, has just become the new leader of the church in Rome after Peter's execution. So if we do come to these slides again, we'll zoom past them. So if we go back to Andrew and Thomas, so Andrew's been heading north. It seems that Andrew kind of he goes up to the Baltic Sea and through Poland, Slovakia, and Romania, and seems to settle there. There are lots of shrines and traditions about where he stays up there. I put there that he does obviously make it down to Greece, because in 67 AD he seems to be in Ephesus, helping to authorize John's Gospel. But that shouldn't be surprising. What we're going to find is he spends most of his time in this northern region. He does kind of track down. I've gone down to Patras, down in the south there. That's historically where Roman Catholicism has said they think he was martyred, but they say they think he was martyred in 60 AD. That is far too soon for the amounts of things that he's actually involved in. And it's not even a consistent legend. It actually comes from a document that was written off by all the early church fathers. So they don't treat it seriously, but somehow that idea has come to us that's where he's finally martyred. I'm sure he gets to Patras. I take a different view, but it's there. And at the same period, Thomas has been heading up to China, as we looked at. I think we looked at those all last time. I'll leave them for you to read. Hopefully everyone got notes, so they're all in there. What have I got? Oh yeah, that's right. Okay. I mentioned that Colossians and Philemon refer to John Mark, which would probably date them as being 63 AD, that they're written. When Nero is in his 8th year of his reign, when Nero's in his 8th year of reign, 62 AD. I think what I meant to say there, sorry, I'm confusing that. It has to be before 63 AD, because basically John Mark, it seems, is martyred in 62. So I don't think it shouldn't say that would date them as 63. It would date them as before. Because in 62 AD, Annianus succeeds Mark as being in charge of the church in Alexandria. Mark seems to pop up at different places. So although we read that he's planted the church on behalf of Peter into Alexandria and he's looking after it, we meet him occasionally in other locations. Paul refers to him travelling around as well. Mark visits Colossae as requested by Paul. So, here we go. And so 60 AD, Simon the Zealot. There you go. I knew I'd put this in somewhere. So they're according to some traditions. So I'm holding it lightly. Root back to a guy called Hippolytus of Rome, who's a 2nd century theologian. So he's very early. Simon the Zealot has arrived in Britain, and he's there during the first year of Boadicea's rebellion, which would be 60 AD, and gets crucified a year later, on the 10th of May 61 AD by Roman Catius Decianus at Caister, which is Lincolnshire, which are quite specific for somebody who's never been to Britain to know about, if you put it that way. So it's just kind of interesting that there's that tradition, although it's ancient. The 8th century, we have another reference, but this is much, much later. But it's kind of sometimes, I say sometimes, you can get things from the 8th, 9th, 10th, even 11th century that are based on documents that were very ancient, but which we don't have anymore. So it's possible sometimes this isn't just in Christian kind of history. It's something that generally historians have to do. Sometimes you have a reference in around 1000 of something that goes back to 200 BC or something like that. So he may have information. He says that Simon, born in Cana of Galilee, who was surnamed Zealot, had received the Holy Ghost from above, travelled through Egypt, Africa, and then Mauritania and all Libya. So he's gone around the part that we've read about already, preaching the gospel. And all the same doctrine he taught to the Occidental Sea and the isles called Britannia. So we have again another kind of reference, the Simon Zealots coming to Britain. As I say, there are lots of, in the mythical area and mythical legendary type nature, there are lots of little kind of interesting connections and references to the British Isles. We can't be concrete about which ones were true and which ones were just assumed later on, because that does happen. But I think that seeing as we know the history and we know that the church does spread and we know that the British Isles are referenced by Tacitus quite concretely, the gospel is there, that we have to see that probably they in some way are reflecting the truth of what's gone on. They're the best we have. And if we want to be cynical, we can say it's not enough. But if we know there's something sapped to have happened, it's the best we've got. Depends which way you want to look at it. So meanwhile, if we come back to Jerusalem, probably 62 AD, it's quite dramatic. James gets martyred. It's a dramatic event. It's recorded by multiple witnesses and historians. I've given you a few: Clement of Alexandria, Hegesippus, Origen, Eusebius and Josephus. All give us accounts of the martyrdom of James, and Josephus actually gives us enough information that we can actually lock it down to a single year. So I put 62 AD. It's possible that Josephus makes a mistake. Josephus gives a lot. He's a good historian. He gives us things you can lock dates into, but he has been known to make mistakes. That's not surprising. So, but the information he gives us would seem to lock it into happening in 62 AD. So back in Jerusalem, all of these things going on around Rome, all of the interest going on, people in nobility in the Julius Caesar's family who are coming into the faith, people coming from the far ends of the empire, maybe from Britain and so on. And in Jerusalem, James gets martyred. So here's Hegesippus's account, fragments from his 5 books. We have his work comes to us quoted by other people, so that's why they're fragments. So basically what happens, the council, James is really well, he's honoured in Jerusalem. So Christianity hasn't split out of Judaism at the moment. It's a sort of a sect, but James is seen as a just. He's referred to as James the Just. He's seen as an honourable person. The ruling authorities come and speak to him and say, look, we really think at the Passover you need to put to bed some of these wild ideas about your brother Jesus, And James takes the invitation to speak, and he stands on the wall and then he preaches Jesus ascended and calls for repentance, which they all get very annoyed about. So they shove him off the ramparts. So We have not done well. This is how it writes. We have not done well in procuring this testimony to Jesus. It's kind of, we gave him the opportunity. We thought he would denounce his brother, but he doesn't. But let us go up and throw him down, that they should be afraid and not believe in him, i.e. Jesus. And they cried aloud and said, oh, the just man himself is in error. Thus they fulfilled the scripture written in Isaiah, let us away with the just man. So James the just, as he gets known, is recognised as being just and is seen as being fulfilled by as he gets thrown away or gets thrown down from the ramparts. Thus they fulfilled the scripture written in Isaiah, let us away with the just man, because he's troublesome to us. So they went up, threw down the just man, and said to one another, now let's stone him, because apparently he's not dead. They pushed him down. He's badly injured, but he's not dead. And they began to stone him, because he was not killed by the fall. But he turned and kneeled down and said, I beseech you, Lord our God and Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. And while they were thus stoning him to death, one of the priests, to whom testimony is borne by Jeremiah the prophet, began to cry aloud, saying, cease what you do, the just man is praying for us. But one among them, so one of the Sanhedrin is saying, you shouldn't be doing this, he's a good man, you can't be doing it. One among them was a fuller, who took the staff. Now obviously if you know about ancient kind of crafts, fulling is actually a great big heavy staff. It's not like a rod, it's you pound it onto cloth to soften up the fibres. So it's a really big heavy thing. So he takes the staff which he was accustomed to wringing out the garments and hurled it at the head of the man, and so he suffered martyrdom. And they buried him on the spot, and a pillar is erected to his memory which still remains. So in the mid 2nd century there is still a marker to James. Those kind of things are important to notice because they're making a claim that could be tested by their contemporaries, so historians take them seriously. Close to the temple, this man was a true witness to both Jews and Greeks that Jesus is the Christ. And then shortly after, he tells us, Vespasian besieged Judea, taking them captive. Technically, it's not Vespasian, but it is under Vespasian that it happens. So we notice that Josephus dates this as 62. Vespasian first starts to kind of harass Judea in 66, which is 4 years later, but it gives you an idea when you're reading ancient histories what they mean when they say shortly after, and that's not uncommon. We often find that in things like Josephus. He'll say, and straight away, and when you try and piece them together, what he actually means is 6 years later, but what he means is by this is these two things are connected. They may not have been instant, but they are part of the same flow. So that this is all happening around 62. You go back to Rome, so you can understand the turmoil is really what I'm getting us. Paul has finished his work around the Aegean. There's a strong church in the top of kind of the Turkey area, below the Black Sea. Andrew's spreading off. People have gone down into Africa. Going back to Rome now. So Luke's now completed both the book of Acts, and he's finalised that and kind of produced his final version of Luke's Gospel. The two are kind of really 2 volumes of the same work, and were probably produced as part of Paul's defence. It's not that he's going to read them in front of Caesar, but they're probably going to be presented to Caesar as part of the evidence that is going to be produced. And so you'll notice that Luke's Gospel is very honouring to Roman officials, as is the book of Acts. So you can understand why if you put it in that kind of context. So he finishes them with these words. These are the final words of Acts. Paul stayed 2 whole years in his own rented house, received all who were coming to him, preaching God's kingdom and teaching things concerning the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. It's worth noting because the standard theory makes the book of Acts written much later. In fact, the Gospel of Luke is written much later after this event. But clearly Luke is written before the book of Acts. And people who go for that theory that Acts is written after Paul's defence have to explain, and they go to great convoluted reasons as to clever suspense things that Luke is trying to do by not telling us what happens to Paul. So we have this strange thing where we leave Paul hanging in this rented house and being well received by everybody, and then we never discover what happens to him. Well, that makes total sense if you understand that actually this has been written as part of Paul's defence. It's come into its final form for this very reason. So after he gets acquitted, we know nothing about that because it's not written up anywhere, but we know it happens. He's there for 2 years, which takes us, so it's in 62 or 63, round there he's going to get acquitted. So he sets sail from Rome to the island of Crete in order to meet Titus. We know that from the letter to Titus. So you got the little red line there going from Rome down to Crete on the map. He then leaves Titus in Crete and sails to Nicopolis. So where's Nicopolis? There's Nicopolis, which we still read about in the letter to Titus. From Nicopolis, he writes the New Testament books of 1 Timothy and Titus. So that's where he writes them from. And actually in that book, of course, he quotes from Luke's Gospel. It's now complete. It's finished. Paul is totally familiar with it because he's had to present it in Rome. And he says, "For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle the ox as it treads corn, and here's the quote, the worker is worthy of his wages." And I put the Greek in there because it's absolutely identical with the Greek of Luke. It's not the same as in Matthew or in Mark. And that's why I put it in Greek so you can see it's identical to Luke's Gospel. And he's referred to it as scripture. And you shall not muzzle the ox as it treads corn. Well, that is an Old Testament quote, but the next bit is New Testament. It's only part of Scripture in Luke's Gospel. So 64 to 66 are Peter's final years. So in July of 66, there's a great fire that destroys much of Rome, and Nero blames the Christians, and there's a persecution. And traditionally, we understand this is the point where Peter gets arrested and then crucified. Apparently upside down. He asks to be crucified upside down, maybe soon after. We're not totally sure how quickly it happens after. The news, though, travels back to Jerusalem, where James, of course, has been just recently executed in 64 as well. Was it 64 I said? Yeah, 62. Sorry, it's 62, wasn't it? 62, James has been executed. So Simon, or Simeon, the son of Clopas, has become the leader of the church there. Now, Clopas, of course, is one of those named on the road to Emmaus. And the early church tells us that the other was Simon, or Simeon, sometimes known as Simeon, Simon or Simeon. And actually, of course, you can tell from reading the New Testament, the different gospel accounts, that Clopas is Jesus' uncle, a fact which is again verified by early church writings, that he's Joseph's brother. But you can actually place it together because he's the husband of a lady called Mary, who's Mary's sister, or Salome is the sister. One of the two is the sister, and you kind of, as you put all the pieces together, what it looks like is that actually his brother by he's the uncle. He's the brother of Joseph, basically, and that's what the early church tell us is the truth, rather than it being Mary who's the blood relative, which makes sense because you wouldn't have two Marys as two sisters, but you would have a Mary and a Mary if one's a sister-in-law, if that makes sense. So what have I put down at the bottom? Yeah, so that's right. Yeah, so Peter is crucified, which means Linus now becomes the leader of the church in Rome. So we have new leaders in Jerusalem and Rome, just in that short little period of turmoil that's been going on. So in Rome, it's Linus. In Jerusalem, it's Simon or Simeon. If we go back to Paul, so Paul possibly visits Spain because he's always been saying that's what he intends to do. So we try and put these things together. So there he goes off to Spain. That we know that there's a church in Cordova. We looked at that last week. That doesn't mean it's the only church, but it's where we actually find relics and remnants that are concrete of Christian activity in the 2nd century. So we know that's the case. Paul may not have been the only one to go there, but that's where he's always intended to go. So we've got a few quotes. They kind of tend to be 4th century onwards, so 300 and something onwards. For after he'd been in Rome, he returned to Spain, but whether he came thence again to these parts, we know not. That's because Tarsus, where some of Paul's family comes from, there are a couple of places called Tarsus, but one of them is in Spain. So that would seem to say that Paul perhaps has some familial connections with Tarsus in Spain, which is why he wants to go back there. Cyril of Jerusalem says Paul fully preached the gospel and instructed even imperial Rome. That's what we're talking about. He stands before Caesar and perhaps gives them the gospel. Carried the earnestness of his preaching as far as Spain, undergoing conflicts innumerable, performing signs and wonders. And the Muratorian Canon, which is, again, it's important, although it's a later document, it's based on earlier records. It mentions the departure of Paul from the city of Rome when he journeyed to Spain. So we have various ancient testimonies that say Paul achieved what he said he was going to do. So there we go. Yeah, that's his final journey. So his final journey, there's legends about Paul making it to Britain, which he considers the end of the earth, put Tertullian's quotes, but I think there are probably other better solutions. As I say, there's various of these things. And I said, while it's unlikely that he does, why did I see Cyril of Jerusalem? Oh, I think, yeah, one of those ones we just looked at says that's where he finally ends up. But what we have seen is that Paul is in contact with Britons, probably in Rome, as we've looked at. And this is where I was originally going to move this to. And I've got it in second time. So we'll skim through here. And that would have made so much more sense, that final slide, had we done all the others and seen the changes of people like Linus and so on. Which is why I thought I'd moved it. But anyway, back to Jerusalem. So in 66, there's trouble starts. I said Jerusalem, yeah. So back to Jerusalem. In Judea, there's now trouble brewing. There's an anti-taxation protest that kicks off, and the Roman governor plunders the temple to pay it. He says, "Well, if you're not going to pay it, I'm just going to take it." He plunders the temple. So of course, as you can guess, because of the way things go in Jerusalem and around Judea, things start to escalate. The Roman garrison is overrun by kind of reactionaries. So Herod Agrippa II, not the first who died last week, he actually has to flee, and all of the Roman authorities have to flee Jerusalem. And so under Simon's leadership, most of the Christians start to heed Jesus' warning, where he talks about, you start to kind of notice these things. They start to remember Jesus' prophecies. And in actual fact, the early church, this is they're reminded because they get a prophetic word to remember it. Don't forget what Jesus said, effectively. So they start making note, and from some point after 66 AD, the people in the church in Jerusalem had been commanded. Oh, here you go. Here's the quote from Eusebius. The church had been commanded by a revelation vouchsafed and approved by men there before the war, to leave the city and to dwell in a certain town of Perea called Pella. So if you look on the map, I've rung Pella in red, which is just halfway up the Jordan between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. And when those that believed in Christ had come there from Jerusalem, the judgment of God at length overtook those who had committed such outrages. So it seems that they leave a couple of years before the city is fully destroyed. That makes rough sense. The troubles start in 66 AD, and they get out before 70. The judgment of God at length overtook those who committed such outrages against Christ and his apostles, and totally destroyed that generation of impious men. There is now not really a big church in Jerusalem anymore, and that's a big change, obviously. 66 to 67, Paul returns to Rome, where he's going to get martyred. We don't know all of the details. Eusebius states that Paul was killed during one of Nero's persecutions, and Nero died in 68. So I'm saying it's probably comes in about 66 to 67. As Tertullian tells us, because he's a Roman citizen, he's beheaded rather than, unlike Peter, who was going to be crucified and gets crucified upside down. So he's entitled to a cleaner death, if that makes sense. So Paul is now executed 66 to 67. You can see how everything is changing. There's no church now in Jerusalem. This is the ends of the apostles, really. Not totally, but we're kind of hitting this point. So in Rome, Paul writes to Timothy, his final ever letter. He makes a reference to Mark there. This is the year. Actually, this is the year. No, this is 68. That's right. Sorry, 68 is the year. I'm sorry. I'm noticing as I go through my notes things I may have put wrong. 68 is the year that Mark is talked. It is actually the year he seems to be executed. He's handed the church over previously, but he probably and it's a bit confusing as to whether those things happen at the same time. 68 seems to be the year that he's executed, but when Paul writes his final letter, Mark is still around, obviously. He gets arrested in these ongoing persecutions that are still going on since the fire of Rome, executed by beheading. Nero dies in 68. 68, Mark is martyred now on his return to Alexandria. A rope is put around his neck and he's dragged through the streets until he's dead. So you can see we're going through another of these massive waves of persecution against the church. But it is still growing. So it's probably around 67. I'm putting the date in, but we know about, we read about in the early church how the remaining apostles are then in Ephesus. So Peter is not there. Andrew is there, so he's presumably back from some of the trips up into the north. And under Andrew's leadership, they contemplate writing some more about the life of Jesus, and decide that actually John should write it up, and they should all endorse it. Which, if you read the end of John's Gospel, there's suddenly a we, and we confirm these things are true. Which the early church tells us was the kind of the group that was gathered there. Paul writes the gospel and they say, yeah, we concur with this. And so John's gospel is specifically written as a supplemental, which is why it doesn't bother trying to cover the same events of the synoptic gospels, which is why you can't particularly kind of build a sense of where Jesus' ministry starts and ends in quite the same way, because it starts in eternity. In the beginning was the Word. And then we blend through a number of Passovers and Feast of Tabernacles and other events. And they're more, if you like, detailed descriptions of key moments, key Jerusalem moments. So it's a slightly different style, and that's the early church's testimony to the writing of John. I put it in 67 to help fit in with other things that we know, which is earlier than a lot of people like to think of John's Gospel being written. Again, I'm aware that I'm probably saying things that don't fit with some of the things you may have got taught. And that's not necessarily because I'm not aware of what consensus views are, but partly because as I come to a point where I'm less convinced of them. And so I'm presenting it how I'm in my own head. I've started to put the things together, if I can put it that way. So 69 is quite a key year. Again, 69 is another point as to why we recognise that the New Testament documents are all written much earlier than most people think. The reason I say that is because right the way through Paul's letters, pretty much, if you find references to Caesar, it never qualifies who. But in 69, there are actually 4/5 emperors. So if you're talking about going to stand before Caesar, you ought to qualify which one it is if you're writing after the event. So in other words, if Luke's gospel, if the book of Acts was written after Nero's death, Luke, as the historian that he is, who qualifies everything, so this happened in this reign, as you have so many emperors that Paul could be heading to talk to, you'd expect him to say, but he doesn't. But anyway, there are these 4 generals who, after the death of Nero, start kind of duking it out to see who's going to be emperor, and Galba and Otto kind of like wear themselves out against. Galba gets beaten by Otto. And then Vitellius and Otto are kind of fighting things out. Vespasian is the 4th general. But Vespasian is down at this stage, actually in around Judea and in kind of trying to suppress the uprising that started in 66, which has pushed the Roman officials out of Jerusalem. So he's not around up near Rome. They all vied for and they all received the title emperor at different points. But on December the 20th, Vitellius finally dies, which just really leaves Vespasian as the only contender for emperor. But as I say, he's preparing to attack Jerusalem at the moment. So in actual fact, what happens is a young future emperor by the name of Domitian, who has escaped from Rome private while this kind of internal fighting is going on, receives Rome, comes into Rome and receives it on behalf of, well, he doesn't receive it on behalf of Vespasian, but he receives it, and he's actually hailed as Caesar for a single day. So I put 4/5. You're normally, it's referred to as the year of 4 emperors, but for a day, Domitian, who's going to be emperor in a couple of emperors' time, as a young man, as he goes in, is kind of seen as the relief. We're getting rid of all this fighting finally, and he gets hailed as Caesar. But the next day, the Senate actually confirmed that they're going to recognise Vespasian as Caesar. So on December the 21st, they declare that Vespasian is now the emperor. So Domitian, but Domitian is given executive power until Vespasian has finally come to Rome, which doesn't happen till after the Jewish War. So several months, the kind of the power on the throne, even though he's not formally the emperor yet, is Domitian, who will eventually be the emperor. And that's worth noting because we know historically people, although we're not told concretely anywhere, but the church has assumed that John is exiled to Patmos in the reign of Domitian, which of course is in the 90s. But actually Domitian is in control of Rome at this point. And I think this is a much better place to fit the exile of John to the island of Patmos, because Rome is incredibly unstable at this point. Jerusalem is under threat. It hasn't yet been destroyed. And so what I put here is that I think therefore Domitian exiles the prophets and seers, because they have been playing a part in this person prophesying this person's going to be emperor, this person's going to be. So my suspicion is, and we hear about this is the kind of thing that does happen. I think I've got a quote, in fact. Yeah, I have. Okay, this is a historian from the Yale Divinity School, Adela Yabo Collins. Early traditions say that John was banished to Patmos by the Roman authorities. This tradition is credible because banishment was a common punishment during imperial period for numbers of offences. Among such offences were the practices of magic and astrology, because prophecy was viewed by the Romans as belonging to the same category, whether it's pagan, Jewish or Christian prophecy. So what she's basically saying is that's a common thing that happened to kind of fortune tellers and foreseers, because Rome is a highly, highly superstitious place. And so a kind of an augur or a soothsayer can come in and make some statements, and in terms of turmoil, you don't want those things around. So this is a very good point for Domitian to actually exile John, if that makes sense. Which fits much better with the stories from the early church as to how the Gospel of John gets written and so on and so forth. So just keep an eye on the time. It's 8:30. That's not too bad. So this is a good point. And it also fits with the fact that Tertullian also tells us that the Romans had attempted to execute John in Rome. So it seems that John is in Rome, and for whatever reason there's some angst, which means that prophets and soothsayers are going to get exiled. It seems that they try to execute him. They try to execute him by dropping him in a bucket of oil, burning oil, but he gets out, and so they decide to send him off to exile. So this is the point I'm going to say and suggest that Paul gets sent to Patmos. Judea is at war with Rome, but the temple still stands. The base church, it should be not there. The base church is no longer there in Jerusalem, of course. The temple is there, but the church has moved out. So February, March AD, these are my thoughts. My take is this is a good point for John to have written Revelation. Now, again, this is purely my thoughts, but I'll explain. If you read Revelation, it never references a destroyed temple. It's all about a new temple, but it never talks about the destruction of an old temple. That the fact that no book in the New Testament makes reference to the destruction of the old temple is pointed out as long ago as about the 60s by John Robinson, who was a liberal scholar. So he's not an evangelical, total liberal. He could not believe that any of the books of the New Testament were written after the destruction of the temple, seeing as from the 1st century onwards, Christian writers made a huge thing about the fact that the temple had been destroyed, which was a proof of the fact that their way of doing their faith was the final way, because there's no temple anymore. You see? And he makes a point that this is not a trivial thing. You will regularly see people have to make reference to it, and they go, well, but they just decided to ignore it. But he's saying there's no way they would have ignored it. And so even in Revelation, you get a sense in Revelation that things are in turmoil. You get a sense in Revelation that Nero has died. But you also get the thing of the kind of the idea of him coming back. And actually, we've just gone through a period where there are umpteen emperors. And so you can see how the angst of who's going to come along and take over next and so on is all very much part of the theme of the book of Revelation. And the idea of a new temple kind of coming, which is not like the old temple, because actually even the church is no longer in Jerusalem. They've had to move out, but the temple hasn't yet been destroyed. So that's where I put it. But don't abandon everything I've said because you don't like that idea. I'm just kind of sharing my thoughts as I try and fit these things together. And maybe in a couple of years' time I've changed my mind again. So. But the key thing, and the thing I quite like, is that therefore then the New Testament is now complete. And that is a really good point. I know it's not good history, but the Old Testament came together as we have it with the building of this temple. If you go back to the book of Ezra, and the book of Ezra and the old books of the law are found, and then the final books of the Old Testament are put together. And it all comes together with the building of the second temple, the temple that is now about to be destroyed, and the New Testament is completed. And once the New Testament is completed, the temple gets destroyed. That's more of, if you like, a Christian faith take than it is a historical take, but I quite like it, so I'll kind of share it with you as a thought. So 5 months later, the temple is destroyed. In April, Titus attacks Jerusalem. 5 months later, it's destroyed, and it's followed by the whole city. So we get to April 70. Jerusalem and the temple are now destroyed. The Roman army is led by Titus, who's going to become emperor after Vespasian. And this is the end of the age. There is no longer, if you like, Paul, when he talks about we are those on whom the ends of the ages have come. The end of the temple age has now gone, and the new temple, which is prophesied in Revelation, which is made up of real people, and the overcomers who I will make pillars in my new temple and so on, is now coming into view. So get our little timeline strip along the bottom there. So where have we got to? Well, this is not a really, this is, I pulled together just for this. It's as I kind of look at it, the green stars are kind of legendary places where we have some stories and evidence of the gospel going at this point in 70 AD. We've got churches in real historic places at this stage, although I'm not quite sure where that one in Gaul is. I think that comes a little bit later. But we know in Rome, we know there's a Christian community just outside Rome and so on. This is not the same as the maps I put up last week, which were done in a very scientific way. But of course, there were less of them there. But these are where we have references in the early church writings and so on and so forth at this point, in a kind of broad sort of sense. So in the years that follow, we know Andrew's going to base himself above the Black Sea, the edge of the Roman Empire. He's going to spend about 20 years living in Romania. That idea was rejected during kind of during the kind of communist era, and historians would say, oh, well, it was just the Romanians appropriating. But there are ancient references to it. So I put some of the references there. Hippolytus of Rome, who lived from 170 to 235. So he's not that far after the event. Origen, who's similar period. Eusebius, who's he's a serious historian, but comes a bit later. So there are ancient records to it too. So just because of the under kind of communism, it was along the lines of, people always want to adopt the most ancient tradition. Romanian tradition actually puts Andrew's martyrdom as between 95 and 105 AD, and actually that he is the last of the apostles. So he's about 85 to 95 years old at that time. That's what the tradition tells us, and that actually fits with the Gospels, because the Gospels tell us about a time when Jesus is asked to pay the temple tax, and he's living in the house of Simon Peter, and Andrew lives in the house with him. But only Jesus and Simon pay the temple tax. which tells us that Andrew is actually below the age, which is 20, of having to pay the temple tax at that point. Okay, does that make sense? Because if Jesus is living in their house, he has to pay the temple tax, and he pays for him and Peter. It looks like he doesn't pay for Andrew, because presumably Andrew's not yet 20. So actually, even there, the kind of ages are fitting together as the traditions go. As I put there, the Roman Catholic tradition has Andrew being martyred in 60 AD. I put it there for reference, because you'll see it. We also know that Paul's apostolic team continues, and we know it continues for several generations. It's perhaps where we find the originating of what's called the Didache, which is actually a really significant document. It dates back to the late 1st century, although for years it was lost. It was found again a couple of hundred years ago. We had it in reference and we know about it. And when you actually get it, it's a kind of collection which is almost like for new converts. So it's sometimes referred to as the Lord's teaching through the 12 apostles to the nations. It's late 1st century. Deals with how to do outreach, how to prepare people for baptism of the Gentiles. It has references to how to relate into Jewish-Gentile relationships. It reflects the text of Matthew's Gospel, which, as I say, fits my view in that Matthew's Gospel is the foundational one. And it's considered a scripture by some of the early churches. And the fact it fits Matthew's Gospel rather than any of the others is a confusion for secular historians who think that Matthew's Gospel isn't the first one written, and that it's a later gospel. But again, it fits, the traditions. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church actually have it as part of their canon, even though they didn't have a copy of the book for some centuries. It was listed as scripture. And you find other Christian writers, early Christian writers, who treat it as scripture because it includes so much of the teaching of Jesus, although what it includes tends to come from Matthew. So it's almost like a digest that's been put together for new converts. It prepares them for baptism, etc., etc. So that to me looks like the kind of the thing being kind of carried by the work of these evangelist apostles who are trying to push out the gospel. So after his release from Patmos, John returns to Ephesus, where he dies around the age of 98, in about 98 AD. So about the same time, just a bit before Andrew. Philip the Apostle's death, it gets a bit confused. These are all after 70. I'm just kind of giving you the sum of after 70 with Philip the Evangelist, and so it's difficult to exactly say. One of the two of them, that should be two of them, one of the two of them is martyred in Hierapolis in Phrygia around 80 AD. It's difficult to tell because the description of the person who gets martyred there could be either of them, because it refers to references to both. But you can understand how that happens. That's not uncommon. When you're just a generation or so away again, you've heard stories about so-and-so who's got martyred. You've heard the name Philip. You weren't sure whether they meant Philip the Apostle or Philip the Evangelist. You kind of fill in extra details, and sometimes it gets a bit confused. But one of them seems to get martyred in Hierapolis, which is in that kind of central area we've looked at so much. Syrian Christian tradition specifies that Thomas is martyred in Mylapore, with a very concrete date, July the 3rd, 72 AD, and notes that he was killed with a spear. And so we come back to where we started, really. I haven't given you a full list of the apostles because some of them are so vague. I just wanted to kind of say where there's a bit of double reference or double confirmation. It doesn't mean it's true, but just means there's more than one kind of vague idea that comes later on. But those years after the destruction of the temple, it seems that the baton is being passed. The use of the Didache is a good reference to that. It seems to get used for about 300 years before it disappears, as a kind of a summary of when someone becomes a Christian, what you do with it. So we come back to those where we started with the quote from Tertullian: "Into the universal earth is gone out their sound, to the ends of the earth their words, for upon whom else has the universal nations believed." And we get that first list, which we saw on the day of Pentecost. I've kind of highlighted them, coloured them in with blobs. We don't know exactly how far they extend or don't extend. And he goes on and gives another list, and all other nations, for instance. And this is only a for instance. By this time, the varied races of the Gaetulians and the Moors and so on. You add those. I've added those nations there that Tertullian refers to. But actually, as we've looked at the traditions and stories, we can fill in some other spaces as well. So we've got Andrew's fourth mission up at the north, Andrew's second mission pushing towards China, St. Aegean pushing towards China, Bartholomew and Thomas down into India, Arabia that we know Paul was learning from at a certain time. So when you kind of look at the mix, there are some bits right at the top in Siberia and so on. We haven't yet, we don't seem to be touching. But in terms of the known empire, the early church has really pushed out its boundaries. They've taken seriously that the commission that Jesus gave to them at the end of Matthew was for them, not for their children's children. They've tried to do it to the best of their abilities, and actually laid a foundation, of course, which has changed the world. So I think that's my final slide. Yeah, there we go. So I will kind of draw my talking bit to an end. But does anyone want to just raise anything or ask anything at this stage? I will qualify what I've said with I've tried to fit things together and without being too forensic, which gets really dull and boring.